Hi everyone, my name's Adam. I'm going to be the chair for the grand final. Incredibly excited. So congratulations to everyone who has made it this far. Obviously an incredible achievement, and best of luck for the grand final. So without further ado, I will ask the Prime Minister to open the debate here.
I guess before I start, thanks to Waterloo for a great tournament, everyone for being here, judging, Jonah, great partner, and Hardhouse. Yay. Great privilege to do this activity. What is the norm of innovation? It's the idea that we can always be doing better. It's progress, that we should get novel things. This comes from the part of our brain that wants the new. We are unsatisfied with the old and existent. We want to do things that we currently cannot imagine. And what is the norm of maintenance? Contentment, that we should strive to keep things the same as they are. And this isn't doing nothing. It's preserving the status quo. Oftentimes, this means a lot of work. It means keeping things as they are, as we expect and anticipate them. And I don't think it's complete stasis either. Like, we're not keeping everything exactly the same as it always has been. I think it probably, in at least the way that this norm is interpreted, involves some degree of forward action, but overall a desire to keep things the same. And when is this happening? This House supposes it's happening now. Why is innovation terrible and maintenance is much better? First, on the macro level, there are just a bunch of things that in our society, as it is, have been really fucked up by the norm of innovations. Things like climate change. I think maintenance means averting this, to try to keep things how they are, implementing the tools that we are already rather successfully using, things like cap and trade and carbon taxes, in order to rein in the rapid warming of the planet and keep things reasonably the same. I think innovation means the kinds of things that companies like Shell are trying to get away with doing, creating new technology that essentially distracts people, waste time, and waste money, things that don't actually solve this really grave existential threat. I think another problem is AI. Large language models are already pretty bad, but I think they're liable to become both more used and worse as the technology develops. I think the more used they are, the more energy they take up, which is really awful for the environment. And I think that to the extent that they play a greater role in our society as it is, it means they're given more power. They replace human jobs without those humans being compensated. The economic effects of this are really terrible, and I think that the decisions they make tend to be worse. They're not as human, they're not made with the emotions and feelings of people in mind. Our society becomes a much colder, more utilitarian one. And this too comes from this idea that progress, that we have a technology that currently exists that we ought to put time and effort into developing further. I think the norm of maintenance is much better because we keep AI at least to what it is now. And then lastly on growth. I think you've all heard of the idea of degrowth. What governments and companies prioritize is not just maintaining their current market cap. What governments want is not just keeping their economy what it is, they want to actively grow. And what that means is just producing more things, right? And I think fundamentally that means increasing things like extractivism, taking more and more from the earth. It means increasing the burden on an ultimately finite number of workers who are pushed to work longer and longer hours, as is currently happening in the world right now. And I think the last thing on the macro level is abandoning what we do well. We have systems that work, that took humans hundreds and hundreds of years to develop. Things like sewage systems and buses and like democratic norms. And all of these things I think seem pretty simple, but as we've seen probably most recently with the latter example, actually require a lot of upkeep, right? We work to, I think, in a world where maintenance is the norm, raise turnout for elections. We implement simple reforms, things like donation caps. We increase bus service like the TTC recently did. And I think in a world of innovation, we probably move past these things. We try and invent new technologies like Uber and Lyft, which make traffic considerably worse and transit considerably more expensive. I think rather than new things like these, we should focus more on what we already have. And perhaps more importantly on the micro level, I think this affects people too and how they live their lives. They always want to be healthier, to be happier, to be more in love with a more beautiful person. And I think the problem that this runs into is that at a certain point this is not achievable, or at least not the worth, the risk, or the money. I think there are real obstacles to a lot of the things that we tend to most want. Love, for example. I think when you are with your partner, you always wonder, is there someone better? I never do this because my boyfriend is great, but that's true of most people, and I think is a consequence of the norm of innovation. You watch porn and romance movies and see that there are these much more physically beautiful people or intelligent people or wealthy people. And so you are less satisfied in the relationships that you are in. And even if you do not choose to leave these relationships, you're just less content. You're always wondering if there's something else. On money, right? You work longer hours to get a better promotion doing a job that probably isn't satisfactory to you. Listen, I think the end result for most debaters is that they go into consulting. They work 90 hours a week. They keep striving and striving to go further and finish up feeling quite miserable with how their lives have gone. That's a really devastating thing. And it's also consumerism, right? Like people buy more things, they want the new, they spend money that they could be spending on perhaps things that are better for them in the long term that, contribute to the upkeep of their lives, paying their mortgage, for example. You see a lot of people fail to do this because they do things like make bad investments. I think on our side you get more money. I'll take opening and then closing. Nothing from opening? Think about it. Closing.
Politicians make up what maintenance is all the time. Media makes up what maintenance all the time. Hardly ever says that maintenance is cutting cabinetry to go back to what it was before.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I think both of these things can be explained all different kinds of ways. But I think ultimately what the delta here is that our base instinct is different in either case. So I think that if our base instinct and what society kind of normalizes is innovation, then Polyev using innovation is something that becomes much more potent as opposed to maintenance, right? Like you can call anything, but at the end of the day, I think what really holds true for people is how they experience it in most of their lives. I think I've done really clear explanation as to what that is. I'll take opening if they've got something.
Sure. Maintenance perpetuates certain kinds of inefficiencies, which means you're wasting a lot of resources in terms of the same things.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that even if you accept that that's true, it's probably worse to innovate on things that already work. But I also think that, when you maintain a system, I think that means, cleaning the clogs out of the pipes, right? Seeing that something isn't quite how you originally planned it and working more toward the original goal of that system as it was, right? You see a bus route that, wasn't quite working out because there was a new apartment building, you changed the route. I think that still very clearly falls under maintenance. I think ultimately the biggest impact in this round is contentment. What are people most looking forward to in their lives? Rich people, they love retirement because they're finally done. They can take a break for 20 years, just pursue the things that they enjoy. Marriage, it's so exciting. You finally found the one and they're walking down the aisle right in front of you. I think we give that feeling, that final feeling of peace and contentment to people in their immediate lives much more quickly and much more permanently. But on the broader level, we recognize that the world as it is one that we are generally happy with, where the worst excesses of climate change are kept in check, where human-created art is still something that exists, where we have systems that took generations to build that still work, that our children, that our grandchildren can count on still working. We get to keep that world on government. They don't on opposition. That's why we're so proud to propose.
I thank the previous speaker for that fine speech. I now welcome up the leader of the opposition to open the case for the opposition bench. Here. Woo!
We live in a world where worsening hurricanes, and typhoons are literally destroying towns and cities and countries on a variety of different coastal lines. There's ethnic cleansing happening all around the world. There are conflict zones. There are 2 literal wars happening at this time in human history. If OG wants to make the case that we live in a world where everything is great, people are happy with the way things are, I don't know what they're smoking, but I don't have any of that on our side of the House. There are going to be a number of things in the speech. First, we're going to explain how this motion works. This is a narratives motion. This motion is not this House would pass a bunch of policies related to maintenance. This is a roundabout how people conceptualize things like innovation and maintenance, how they make decisions based off of that narrative, and which narrative we need to prefer with regards to people's individual lives. Then we'll talk about downstream impacts that might come from that later in our speech. It's a crucial clarification to make. It does make a world of a difference. Okay, what is the purpose of a narrative, right? I think what is really important to clarify in the context of this round is that in the absence of some sort of social narrative, people still come to their own decisions and their perceptions about how things ought to function. Our argument on opening opposition is the default presumption of most individuals is this norm of maintenance for a number of reasons. One, it is by proximity. People know what their life currently looks like. They know what their day-to-day currently looks like. They know the systems and institutions they currently participate in. But 2, it is reinforced by hierarchy. That is to say, most people don't have a lot of agency, money, lobbying power, or political power, which means hierarchy is incentivized to keep them in the status quo that they are currently in. in. So maintenance is much more easier for you to conceptualize. So you don't need a norm of maintenance on side government because most people already understand and default to maintenance as their basic decision-making criteria. You need a disruptive norm that makes sure that people are not content with their circumstances, that people are open and receptive to change, that are open to visualizing a world that could look substantially different than the one that they currently live in. Because I'm sorry, OG, this world does suck, right? Another thing that I want to point out with regards to this framing is I'm not really sure what OG is talking about with regards to past or present. Like, they can't have it both ways. Either this applies to all past things, in which case I will gladly bite the bullet of penicillin was good, right? Having healthcare and medical innovation was good. Having the life expectancy of an average human go from 30 to 70 in the course of 200 years through various innovations and breakthroughs was good. I'm going to stand on all of that. I think those are great impacts. Or it happens in the present, which means all of the harmful effects of innovation with regards to climate change have already happened. We've innovated ourselves into a hole. We need to innovate out of it. I think that's the reasonable framing characterization of this round. Okay, so let's talk about what the norm of innovation actually looks like. I think that's really important in the context. Right? We think innovation is a disruptive norm. It is disruption of the status quo. It is being willing and receptive to making changes that are not in the ways things currently function, right? We think that this innovative norm has been accepted by society in the context of maintenance because this gives people hope, right? People see their daily lives, they see maintenance on a day-to-day basis, and they think if there's a possible chance that we could change things, make things better, then this is something that they would want to prefer. We think this is why innovation has been such a disruptive thing. It gives people the hope to actually think that their lives might be better than they are in the status quo. Who spreads this norm? Because OG doesn't talk about this at all. We think this norm actually impacts three crucial areas of society. One, advocates of public policy, right? What does this mean? It means people are more receptive to innovation and making disruptive changes when things like funding scientific research to improve society, funding things like reforms to the medical system to make it work cheaper and more efficiently than it does in the status quo, funding NASA for fuck's sake, which the US for some reason wants to defund. I don't know why. They make bad decisions. These types of things are more likely to be well received by the public. They have massive public downstream benefits, like the funding that went to the Center for Disease Control ended up developing the COVID vaccine, a great innovation on our side. I think these types of things are more likely to happen. These decisions are more likely to happen on our side. But two, business leaders are also impacted by innovation. Yeah, there's tech bros and they do a lot of stupid things a lot of times, and that's really bad. But I think innovation is an interesting norm because it actually puts societal progress and capitalism on the same team, right? And what does that mean? It means a lot of the innovation and technologies that are beneficial originally come from the private sector as well. These things are still beneficial at a societal level. Look at things like Starlink that Elon Musk put out. It's actually brought internet to literally millions of rural people that do not have access to information. I think these things are generally good as well. So whether the actual innovations come from public sector funding or private sector innovation for capitalistic reasons, there's still going to be downstream benefits that come from that as well. Okay, let's then talk about all of the crucial impacts that OO is going to steal in this round that are really, really important. I'm going to talk about three major ones. The first is climate change and the environment. And I think this is the most crucial impact you're going to get in this entire round because I'm just going to point out the Paris Climate Agreement literally builds in strategies for environmental reform of technologies that do not exist yet. A large portion of limiting the actual carbon in the atmosphere in the Paris Climate Agreement is inventing effective carbon capture technology, which is currently being innovated in both public and private markets. We think these types of things are good and important, and if we don't invent them, we are literally fucked, right? I think this is an important benefit that's going to come for our side. It's going to come through things like agricultural reforms of that nature as well. Innovation is going to be necessary. I don't think innovation is actually counterintuitive to the environmental impacts. I think it's actually necessary for the environmental impacts to occur in the first place because in the absence of that technology, we're not going to get meaningful solvency for those issues. The next thing I want to talk about is, POI, sure.
Yeah, so are VCs, once the norm no longer exists, just going to think, I don't want to make money anymore. I guess investment isn't important?
No, okay, so this is the weird thing, right? The way narratives work is it impacts people on the margins. So the VCs are going to want to innovate no matter what because they want to make money. The average person is going to have their perception changed by the norm of innovation if they were already biased towards maintenance. So VCs are bad no matter what, but on our side, the average person is still more receptive to innovative policies like funding public policy research, funding the innovations needed to fight climate change. VCs don't really change on either side of the house. I don't know why that's your argument in the context of this round. The next thing is sustainability, right? Let's completely decouple the
sustainability consumerism argument that government is going to try to make here. Like, I don't actually think sustainability is at odds with innovation as well. Why? Because in the status quo, we have a lot of consumption, we build a lot of things. We need to innovate to do less of this kind of production, right? Like, if we're really upset at the number of plastics, for example, that we're producing and putting into the environment, we need to innovate other materials that we could use instead that are recyclable, right? Innovation literally means being receptible to some sort of social change. That social change is necessary in the face of massive problems. If OG doesn't accept that these problems are valid, they can't win this round. But lastly, I think this just reframes the way people approach social movements in society as well, right? It doesn't actually matter what the cause specifically is. It's that if people can envisage a world that does not function the way it currently does, they are more likely to try to get active in actually changing the norms that currently exist as they are. If a government oppresses you as an oppressed individual, you don't just accept that this is something that is going to continue to exist. You envisage a world in which you have rights, you have power sharing, you have constitutional powers, and then you fight and lobby for those, right? Our side is a side of hope. Our side tells you that your life sucks right now, but with innovation, your life could be better. Let's get on it. Let's fix it. Their side says today is fine. Today is not fine. So proud to oppose.
I now welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government bench. Here.
As opposition states, innovation tells you that your life is not okay. The problem with this is that these norms of innovation are co-opted largely by the most impactful powers in our society. The people who are interested in consumerism, the people who are interested in extractivism. They are co-opted so that people buy into these things. The essential flaw in opposition's case is that they tell you, quote, we innovated ourselves into this mess, we need to innovate ourselves out of this mess. But the issue is that the problems they identify in society were created by this norm itself. It is therefore impossible for them to claim that the way to get out of it is by doing the same thing, by doing the same innovation. Why is this different on our side from defending, maintaining the status quo? Because they need to prove that their side meaningfully gets better. Our side will say that there are ways to make the society run so that it is better, but that it doesn't get worse. Crucially, what are the things that people care about most, like in Canada, for example? What are their biggest qualms with society today? It's things like not being able to access a doctor. It's things like not being able to access, housing. The problem with innovation is that it incentivized governments to prioritize policies that were not focused on maintenance, that were not focused on reliably funding things that were working pretty well, like our healthcare system, or our roads, or our public transportation. Because the interest wasn't in keeping things that were working pretty well continually working. It was to make our economy grow exponentially in a way that doesn't actually work and that exacerbates social inequality and income inequality. The priority of governments needs to be to the maintenance of these systems that work. That is how we create a society that people are actually more happy with. They can't just say that innovation magically makes things better, because it doesn't. Society is not linear. We can say that there are a lot of things we can point to in the society that work well, that just need people to care about maintaining them, care about maintaining our parks and such that do a huge impact on sustainability, care about maintaining our democratic norms that are slipping. This is the problem with a linear view of progress. Weimar Germany was a lot more progressive than the Germany that you saw in the decades after. Progress is not linear. If you work on maintaining the norms of society when things are going generally relatively well, and work on making sure people are benefiting the most from that, that is the most effective way to ensure utility within society. What do we get specifically from them in opening on the specifics? They tell you, first of all, in framing, that you don't need a norm of maintenance because people are generally susceptible to the idea of maintenance. First of all, I just don't know why this is true. I don't know if it's true that humans in their nature are prone to maintenance. Cam already told you that people are prone to like the nice new thing. I think that's also compelling. Humans are kind of complicated. I don't think you can just claim they like maintenance, so we don't need this. But crucially, our society isn't focused on maintenance. Our society neglects things that work and neglects things that are important because we're attuned to always looking for growth, for always looking for better, even when we've landed on things that work and just need more funding. And this is what's important, because they tell you end up funding good things like NASA or vaccine research. But what's the actual delta here? I think that this doesn't actually mostly fund good things. It funds the things that large corporations wanted to fund. It funds the things that people are co-opted into believing are important innovations in society, like AI, or vastly a vast expansion of consumerist goods. These are the things that it's mostly used on. In terms of the actual necessary funding, yeah, you might see a little bit less funding on research, although I think it's negligible or not negligible, but I think it's relatively marginal because most of the funding isn't going to these things. But obviously, this isn't a zero-sum game, right? Governments still have an interest in funding these things on either side, and I'll get into why that matters a lot more for our side than for their side. But yeah, I'll take the closing.
Yeah, so how is the B going to define what constitutes innovation, and presumably they're also going to define what constitutes maintenance, which is people still driving cars all the time, it's still people having exactly the same standard of living, it's still people living in single-family homes. Who defines why is maintenance going to be building public transport for poor people?
Yeah, well, okay, so a few things here. First of all, I think that what's important is that we can, at the very basic level, prove that we can provide a society that is as good and marginally improved than what is now. Their burden is to prove that this metric of innovation, which they say leads to a society that is bad, leads to the present society, is what they're saying, that will somehow make society better. That is their burden in this round. What we're saying is that we have had systems that work pretty well. We have had democracies that have worked relatively well, like being representative, and we have had systems of public transit that have gotten worse. So it's not like we've never had these systems, it's just that they're getting worse because as a society, we're not interested. It's not our goal to maintain them. That is crucial. And it's crucial also when we talk about climate change and technology, because this is literally an example of corporations co-opting the norm of innovation to distract people from what is actually important climate policy. We spend way too much on giving Shell and Esso, billions and billions of dollars every year of our taxpayer fundings to research carbon capture, which they are just interested in re-burning those to make more money. This is just a scam that is being used through the norm of innovation to sell you something that doesn't work. This is much harder to do with maintenance, with a norm of maintenance, because it necessarily contradicts these capitalist, consumerist understandings of always wanting growth, of always wanting more, of always wanting better. You stifle the ability of corporations to have that kind of power when you imbue these norms into society. But crucially, and this is perhaps the most important thing that you will get from my speech, all the impacts you get on side opposition are relatively marginal because they rely on a very macro level. And the unfortunate thing in this debate is that a lot of people just are going to, on either side, norms will affect them somewhat, but on either side on a macro level, people, like VCs, will still invest. There's a marginal difference there, but for the most part, there's a certain amount that norms can do on a macro scale, and we've proven why that's better on our side. But note that they did not respond at all to these huge micro benefits, the individual benefits you get as a person, when you can feel satisfied in who you are, not being continually told that you're not good enough, not being continually told that your allotment in life is bad, and that there's nothing you can do to fix it except for worship your capitalist overlords proud.
I thank the previous speaker for that fine speech. I now welcome up the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the case for the opposition bench. Here.
Before I start, I just want to say thank you to my partner Vidit for doing this turn with me. Last time we debated, I think, was in 2021 or 2020, something like that, where we did the Bates Pro-Am. We were 17th, narrowly did not break, but Vidit has been a transformative type of guide. He has been inspirational to me. For those of you who know him, you know how much of an amazing person, successful and everything else he is, but ultimately just a very pleasant person to be around. Very grateful to know you, Vidit, and I'm looking forward to many more years, maybe not debating, but a friendship. there is a very inherent contradiction in the human condition. And that is that we always look towards the fact that things are bad. We look at the circumstances of right now and we perceive that things are not going to get better. We look at the fact that there's new technological developments and we instantly get in a mindset that it is doomer, nihilist, and it's inevitably not going to be good. But if we look at the trajectory of history, it is innovation that has got us through everything. It's innovation that has increased our quality of life. It was manufacturing, agriculture, all these innovations. So yes, opening government, just do your doomerism again as we've done for decades and decades. Maybe this time everything's going to be terrible. Maybe this time things crash and burns. But let's be real. The historical path, the determinism of humanity is one where innovation has only benefited us, and that's why we must keep this norm. I'm going to do a couple of things. Firstly, I want to talk about what this motion looks like because I think it's incredibly important. I think what we explained to you is that this is a societal standard or expectation. Laundry listing a bunch of potential benefits on either side of the house is not enough. You have to connect it to what you could meaningfully get out of something like a norm, which sets the expectation. We tell you that this manifests in terms of social validation, that people are here to these norms to conform with societal values, of the incentives that structures have in of themselves and how they reward others, and in terms of like the media, who they platform and who is glorified and everything else. The most important thing here is that we don't have to claim tipping points. We could just claim scaling. This is a norm. Everyone's going to point out and try to wash a bunch of impacts on both sides of the house, saying that there's reasons why things are going to happen and things won't happen. But let it be known, you cannot wash away all of our impacts. On the margins makes a difference. That funding additional that we receive, that ability to pass that law, that ability to make that decision to change yourself on your own, these are on the margins decisions that we support on our side of the house, so don't let everyone just wash things away. Firstly, what are the inherent characteristics of innovation and maintenance? I think innovation is inherently about change, dynamism, and looking things forward. We're not going to be able to laundry list you all the ways that this motion is going to manifest. CO is probably going to take some really niche application. But what we will do is give you some kind of very broad, abstract understanding that then will structurally mechanize any other following applications of this motion. Maintenance is about staticity, that things are good right now. What is a norm of innovation over maintenance? How is it spread? How does it work? Anything else? Here's the problem, and this is very complicated, so you're going to have to ride with me. On maintenance, the problem right now is that there's materially current realities that are bad, so there's often an incongruency between messaging and lived experiences. So when you tell people to maintain, they understand that their lived experiences in a lot of circumstances for what Vidit said and what I said, for example, climate change and for example, uses a capacity to focus on the negative because of sensationalism, negative biases we all have. We all perceive things necessarily in a negative light, and then secondly, all these cognitive biases become accustomed to status quo. For example, the law of diminishing return, people do want more, which is weird. I'm saying people want more. People want some kind of change. But the problem then also is what we point out in innovation, that people do not want massive amount of change. That is, they do not want to be able to want to see things forward. They don't want to gain and be the individual to step forward in some kind of collection action problem to be the one that takes and sacrifices. It's also hard to conceptualize the future and to give forward to innovation. So if there are forces that make you both want to change and, for example, not want the current status quo, but there's also forces that make you really want to be static, then what necessarily beats out? What we tell you is that the default is to maintenance because one, there's an unclarity of action, and two, there's an uncertainty of outcomes. That is, at the end of the day, even as unsatisfied as I am, I would rather see default to right now. Why is this incredibly important? It's because politicians are able to hijack this and represent the narrative in this kind of way to appeal to this, despite the fact that people might be somewhat sympathetic to innovation, but the fact that they're able to appeal to this natural disorder, and the fact that people don't want to take that risk and next step, they're able to inform them. Why does this norm create the necessary disruption and tipping point? One, it puts people on a pedestal for engaging in this behavior. So yes, you might not be able to conceive this. You might not be able to conceive the future or anything else, but you're able to appeal to those very things that we pointed out, that people are unsatisfied with the current circumstances and make this kind of change happen. But secondly, you're able to have just a better messaging that people are much more affirmative to. Things like, for example, hope that things could get better and provide tangible solution, which you structurally can't get on their side of the house because their type of narrative and messaging is one that inherently is non-solvent. It's saying things are okay right now, but it doesn't solve anything, which is not something that people are going to be necessarily receptive to, and excitement because it's novel. So ultimately, what does this motion then do? What manifests in the absence of motion? What does it do? Innovation, we're able to produce more efficiencies, we're able to create novel solutions, we're able to have innovation to have certain thresholds. That is, innovation only works when you have a certain amount of buy-in and people are willing to sacrifice. When you're able to implement that new kind of policy and you're able to, for example, try it out, which people don't want to do, and this kind of innovation compounds to solve all the real problems that we could list on CO and we could list on opening opposition. But secondly, in terms of maintenance, one, perpetuates inefficiencies because they're outdated and often look towards obsolete. They're lazy and not critical. For example, if you have this maintenance narrative, then those individuals in government are unlikely to try to solve these issues and make things better because, as I told you, they default to what things are right now, even if things are not good. And it's so sad. People default to what is right now, even if it's not good. And that's something we could change. Secondly, maintenance typically addresses problems after they arise, rather than not solving the root, which means that you're spending an incredible amount of sums of resources and money doing nothing, which discourages future actions. Thirdly, it necessarily is mutually exclusive. That is, to have innovation and disruption, you have to take actions that are against maintenance. When, for example, you implement a new bylaw to create a fundamentally new solution, it changes people's circumstances. It's anti-maintenance. So these are things that we have to push people to go through the norm, but they can't fundamentally get that on their side because they're locked out because of focus on maintenance. And lastly, maintenance typically addresses problems after they arise. Before that, I'll quickly take closing.
Do you find it more fun to wash your existing clothes or go buy new ones?
I'd probably go buy new ones, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, look, this motion is going to apply in different circumstances in different contexts. My point is I think on aggregate, the current powers are able to abuse maintenance, and the default resting is on maintenance, and the circumstances that we specifically want to talk about are ones that are more important in terms of innovation. So, what are the impacts then? Firstly, we tell you that money and direction of policy is going to the different causes that we want to talk about, like, for example, innovate, like ecosystem, environmental activism. It gets stronger because this narrative is a lot more able to capture people's attention and get them to make change. Secondly, where there's skepticism or natural fear of expansion or change, like AI, we're able to make these solutions go through, and like AI is going to be good, generally speaking, because the efficiencies, improving quality of life, and past tendencies. And lastly, on an individual level, on opening government, the fundamental problem is that capitalism society still exists. So if you tell people to be complacent, that doesn't necessarily mean that the systems around them won't tell them it's bad. Innovation and this narrative breaks this cognitive deadlock that I explained to you that people have, where they basically want change but can't make change. And because of this social norm, you're able to produce innovations to therefore improve your life and align with the system that already exists, because fundamentally capitalism is not going anywhere. And ultimately, I think we still get maintenance on both sides of the house to some extent. So ultimately, the structural mechanisms are quite clear here. Their innovation is an incredibly important thing, but we get stuck in this mental congruity of not getting it solved. It's only through this norm are we able to make this happen. Proud to oppose.
I thank the previous speaker for that fine speech. I now welcome up the government members to continue the case for the government's end. Here, here.
I will keep the thank yous very brief. Thanks, Anders. You've been a great partner. I haven't had that much fun debating in a while, and you made it a very fun weekend, so thanks for this. On CG, we're going to tell you that excess innovation is a bad allocation of economic resources. It leads to low utility per dollar for most people, massive amounts of waste, and generally is extremely, extremely harmful. And don't worry, the rest of my speech will not sound like it's from an economics textbook. First, I want to deal with OO and deal with this whole framing that they give of how this debate exists on the margins, and also explain why a lot of the innovation they tell you is going to happen that's really, really important, that is going to save the world, is probably going to happen on both sides of the house. I think that the most important innovation is just obviously symmetric in this debate, right? People dying from diseases will want medication. People who fear for extinction are going to want solutions funded to climate change. And I think the narrative is just not the tipping point in lots of these cases. So the question is whether the excess innovation that people only crave because they're told they ought to want it is going to be the tipping point for the world being saved in this debate. And I think that there are a variety of reasons why it's probably not. So first, I just want to talk about how this narrative actually proliferates on our side of the house, because I think this was a gap in OG. I think, first of all, this happens in marketing and advertising campaigns. So it tells you, if you're a fast fashion company, that you need this season's newest trends. If it's a technology company advertising to you, it's like, you need a phone with a fourth camera now. This looks like, people or companies preying on people's insecurities to sell them products and say that this additional excess innovation is going to make your life significantly better. I think this looks like also the perception of prestige that's often associated with innovation. So prestige, I think, is innovation, I think, is valorized by this narrative existing. We tell people that it's a more noble pursuit to build new things versus improve or work on maintaining existing things. This is why, for example, like tech CEOs are often really, really discussed as like people we should aspire to and people that do very impressive things. Whereas like I doubt that anyone in this room could probably name the CEO of like a major insurance company because people don't perceive insurance as very exciting. I think this also looks like investors perceiving that they're going to get much higher potential gains from investing in companies that propose to do innovation rather than that have like a tried and true tested business model. And I think that this has been observably true, right? Like look at how many people invested in startups in like the 2010s that ended up going bust because they weren't that successful or they just didn't have like a good product at the end of the day. But I think also there are reasons why this like states decide to engage in this, right? These are hallmark projects. They think that it's good to fund a new project, i.e. like the Liberal government thinks it's more exciting to like fund high-speed rail than spend money improving Via Rail, which I take quite often and has a lot of problems, let me tell you. Because it's a nice thing to be associated with them, it's good branding, etc. I think that there's also reasons why good maintenance is more likely in the counterfactual. Why is that? First, I think people don't demand these things if they can't observe them, right? Like you can't observe the counterfactual. If I don't know that I could have 5 cheap sweaters for the price of 1, I'm not gonna wanna demand that anymore. So if this narrative doesn't exist, I literally don't know what I'm missing out on because it's not produced anymore. You don't have that excess innovation that tells me that I ought to want it. These things don't get funded, these projects don't happen. But second, I think that there's still money to be made, right? Like legacy companies often work, they're profitable, like maintenance is a good way to make money still. And I think finally, people are somewhat risk averse. So like they prefer familiar medications versus like new things that are potentially untested or that have like limited time on the market where we can't really observe the long-term impacts. And this is also why you still solve the problems O identifies, right? Like people are risk averse, so they're willing to fund things like vaccines, etc. Before I go on, sure, I'll take closing.
Yeah, so first, there's like no shortage of money going into things like the Dow Jones Industrial, legacy industrial manufacturing that's not super innovative but is relatively stable. But 2, consumers are smart. They notice when things that they used to like look different now. There's lots of backlash. Consumers will at least throw some incentive to innovate on it.
Okay, on the first thing, I think that it's better that people put their money into the Dow than like crypto in the status quo. And I think that is probably part of the trade-off in this debate, right? Like it's a new thing. I think crypto is a perfect example. We don't have a great idea of what it's going to be useful for yet, but because people think it's new and will find a purpose eventually, they put lots of money into it, even though it's relatively risky. So I think that trade-off is obviously clear. I'll take opening too, if you guys still have one.
The United States literally wants to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I think you still need to prove why, in the absence of a norm of innovation, people are going to demand these essential things that you say happen on your side.
I mean, I told you it's that people are risk averse and fear extinction. The reason the United States is pulling out of the climate agreement is not because like people don't fear, or it's because people like don't believe climate change is actually a threat to them, so they probably don't want to fund innovation to fix it on their side either. I think that's definitely symmetrical. Now I want to explain what we think the harms of excess innovation actually are. So all the innovation and excess of people demanding like solutions to the problems that exist in their lives, i.e., you know, like medications, etc. I think the first thing is that you have much, much more planned obsolescence existing in the economy. So we have companies, for example, that like produce, I think this produces insane amounts of waste, both in terms of production and disposal, right? Like people get new cell phones roughly every 3 years in many, many cases. I think in the counterfactual, you would probably have like more companies providing ways to update the batteries or manage or maintain the phone you currently have so it lasts longer. And I think consumers are less willing to put up with planned obsolescence in a world where this narrative doesn't exist. That means that you don't put all the resources into producing these goods that ultimately end up in a landfill, and I think that that's generally a good thing. But second, I think benefits are often just not accessed by a lot of consumers and people on opposition's world, right? Like most people don't need a cell phone camera that is as good as what they have access to. Most people's computers have GPUs that are like way, way, way too powerful for what they're actually planning to do, but people end up paying for these things because they're told that they ought to want them and because they think the innovation is good. And I think that that's very, very harmful, and I think people just don't benefit from the extra money that they end up spending on these things. They're not able to reap that utility. I think that there's also trade-offs in terms of talent, investment, and resource allocation, because people who are very, very skilled decide that they're going to work on the innovative projects rather than deciding or working on how we ought to maintain the things that currently exist in society, which means that you have less maintenance happening because things fall apart. People don't want to spend money on these things. States don't want to fund them. The most talented people don't want to put research into them, don't want to spend their careers there, and that's often bad because it means that systems that currently exist fail. I think you lose out on things like research on, you decide to prioritize research into new drugs versus research on how to make existing drugs cheaper and maintain access to them for many, many people. I think generally you don't improve existing systems. You decide to let infrastructure decay because you think that it's better to build a new project that is newer and shinier rather than put money into fixing an existing one because you think you might enjoy the new project more. I think finally, even if you design things with, if you design things with the belief that they're going to be around for a long time and that they're going to be maintained, you would spend more money on ensuring that they're done well because you don't have to, first of all, bank the money for innovation down the line. You just have more resources freed up. But also, I think that when you don't have planned obsolescence or you think that things are going to be around for a while, you put more thought into how they ought to exist. You decide to solve the problems that might arise. You're more preemptive with how you design things. For those reasons, proud to propose.
I thank the previous speaker for that fine speech. I now welcome up the opposition member to continue the case for the opposition bench. Here.
I'd like to do just a slightly longer thank you. I want to thank Rhys and the McGill Debating Union. Back in like 2020, 2021, we would host meetings and socials where like 4 people showed up, and Rhys was always one of them. And now that we're at this tournament, absolute MDU dominance in the break, in the final, and in everything, I'm just really happy and glad that we did not die during COVID, and all the great kind of memories that we've made are able to continue. And I'm really happy with the next generation of the MDU. Okay. I know for a fact that Sarenna's boyfriend owns crypto stocks, not because he's a crypto bro, but because he thinks that they will go up and he will make cold, hard cash. Companies are not going to stop sending $100 million advertising budgets on closing government because people, they want to make money. They want to make people desire to have money so that they can increase the line go up. Private equity is going to keep trashing legacy companies on their side of the house because it's profitable. They want to milk Red Lobster for every real estate dollar they've got. Fundamentally, the problem with the opening team and closing government is that they forget we live under capitalism. We live under democracy. Incentives to do things like improve, incentives to do things like change exist. Because of the free market, if there is consumer demand for it, things will happen. The reason that Apple has a right to repair program now is because consumers ask for it and there are people who are buying it. The entire point of a free market economy is that if someone will buy it, someone will want to give it to them. We think that CG is out of this debate. But firstly, I am going to actually mechanize why this narrative does not fundamentally change the biggest structures of society. Sarenna flagged this in her speech. I'm actually going to mechanize it for you. 1, capitalism just exists. People want to make more money because you have more money, so you have nicer things. That inherently means that Eli Lilly doesn't make drugs like Ozempic, Novo Nordisk doesn't make Ozempic because they really care about the health of society. They saw an opportunity for a market where they can make money, hundreds of millions of dollars off of diabetics, and they decided to make it so their stock price could go up and their investors would be happy. This is just going to happen on either side of the house. And note, opening opposition does not really mechanize why this innovation is inherently good on their side. We agree this innovation could be bad, but it's going to happen on either side, because on either side we live under a dictatorship known as no alternatives, and that means people are going to participate in the free market economy. The vast majority of innovation happens because of capitalism. We think that doesn't change. But you might ask yourself, okay, but there's government-funded labs and stuff. That brings me to my second incentive, democracy or leadership over the people. Politicians want the material conditions for their biggest supporters to improve. Whether they frame it as innovation or whether they frame it as maintenance doesn't matter. Pierre Poilievre wants to axe the tax because he wants his corporate buddies to have to pay less corporate taxes. Whether he funds it as, whether he frames it as this is an innovative change because it's going to innovate the Canadian economy, or this is a maintenance change because we want to go back to the way that things were before and they were better. It's going to happen because, again, it's about the cold, hard material interests of politicians at hand. The second thing that I want to say here is that extreme situations necessitate innovation. Necessity is the mother of innovation. What that means is that people didn't give a crap until climate change until they saw the effects itself. California did not spend nearly as much money spending forest fires before half of their state was already up in flames. And so we think that when it comes to issues like climate change, the problem is people are not forward-facing. People have never, ever priced in long-term decisions into their short-term electoral calculus. And so we think that climate change is going to be solved on either side because people are going to start realizing very soon as more bad things happen to the climate that we're really fucked and we probably have to do something about it. That's probably why in the past year there's been way more awareness about how warm it's been, how many natural disasters there have been. Again, we think that these extreme situations are going to force people to change, are going to force people to adapt, no matter what they want at either side of the house. The end implication of this is simple. Human nature on a very macro level is difficult to predict. The pandemic could happen. The entire world are shut down. Words can be used to manipulate people. Whether you frame a new product on the market as you're helping maintain people's closets, or you are innovating their closets into a new style, companies are going to do whatever is the most effective for them. That implies that almost every other team and almost every other point in this debate is completely moot. What do we think actually matters? When it comes to social norms, they are most likely to influence your day-to-day feelings and desires, your relationships, how contented you are when you wake up in the morning. We agree that opening government is the only team in this debate who has said any analysis on this. But the fundamental problem of opening government is that they agree with us that people always want to go back to the past. There are three fundamental reasons for this. One, rose-colored glasses. You're more likely to remember good memories and suppress bad memories because bad memories hurt. You don't want to play them over and over. People are probably going to focus on better things that have happened to them before remember things better than they were. But secondly, life gets more complicated the older you get. When you're a kid, you just cry and play all day. Then you have to get into university. Once you're in university, you have to get a new job. Once you get a new career, you have to start thinking about when am I going to have babies. Then you have to think about retirement. The exponential growth of complicated life decisions with big impacts only continues to grow as you get older, and it is natural to long for simpler times, to long for your childhood. The last thing is, as OG themselves already flagged, uncertainty is terrifying. When we know what the status quo looks like, we know that it's a level of pain that we can sustain, it's a level of pain that we can handle. We don't know what's going to happen to us in the future. But there are three fundamental reasons that you cannot go back to the past, unlike what opening government tells you. The first is that people change. Your relationships are never going to go back to the way they were. You have kids. Your SO's parents could get very sick and they have to move in with you. You could get injured. Your fundamental life conditions are going to change. But more than that, your spouse is just going to change. They're going to get new hobbies. They're going to get new friends. You're not going to be able to control and make sure that their personality stays the same. And in fact, we think one of the leading problems of relationships is people stagnating, not moving forward. People's personalities changes. People's preferences change. You cannot long to go back to the honeymoon phase or the beginning of your relationship. You must accept that you have to move forward. I'll take opening.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the past, we're talking about the present. So even if Jonah changes his hobbies, I still love him because I'm content with how things are. I don't know how the past
Okay, but let's see if we're in the present. You want to keep your relationship, you want to maintain your relationship. But what if your partner gets a promotion? They want to move to another country. That is immensely scary. What if your partner is starting to think about wanting to have kids, wanting to get married? You don't want to commit. That's terrifying. That's changing your status quo. I think whatever the time scale that you're thinking about, I think when you care about maintenance, you presumably also regret the times where you could not maintain, when things changed, when you can never go back to them. We also think that cost of living just changes. Inflation and food costs are outpacing wages. People have to re-educate themselves. People have to get jobs. People get made redundant all the time. We think that telling people that this threat is real, making people realize that they cannot rely on their economic conditions and they have to move forward, it's something that is good for people to internalize when they're thinking about what kind of job should I get? Should I try to go for that new promotion? Should I try to pick more money? The answer we say is yes, because your capitalist overlords are going to make you. But the final thing that I want to note here is just that you get bored. The reason that the suburban hell is a common trope in movies is that if you wake up every single morning, you do the same thing, you go to work, you come back, you kiss your wife, you watch TV, and you go to sleep, people generally agree that that sounds horrible because you don't want to do the exact same thing every single day. People are not animals that can be kept in a zoo. People are not hamsters. People naturally crave change. But for the reason that I told you about, it's incredibly difficult for people to accept innovation. People don't want to go back to school. People don't want to accept that their partner is changing, accept that their relationship is changing. On our side of the house, the narrative is very different. When you do glamorize going back to school, getting your new degree like we do in the media today, you glamorize growing with your partner, changing with your partner in new phases of life, but that's the only point at which, on the most intimate levels, people feel okay with the terrifying reality of the future they're faced with. For those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the previous speaker for that fine speech. I now welcome up the government to conclude the case for the government bench.
I'd also like to thank Sarenna. I met Sarenna like 8 years ago when she clapped me in high school in debate, and so it's very nice to be on the same team as her, clapping other people, hopefully. Fingers crossed in the final. Anyway, so thank you so much, and it's been great debating with you. We think that it's been very unclear so far in this debate where exactly the narrative resides and whose behavior has changed. CO is just insane. They're like, look, it changes nobody's behavior. I think Sarenna's quite precise. Consumers are individuals who have their minds changed by things like advertising. This means that they substantively change the types of things they buy, and that behavior affects the way that companies produce things. People who are interested in getting a job after university go into socially valorized positions, and those valorized positions are ones in innovation, not ones in maintenance. We identify exactly where people change, and that is the first thing that allows us forced to weigh over OG. Second of all, it's not a regrets motion, not clear what climate change has anything to do with it. Another reason why we weigh over OG. What is the extension then? We explained to you that because people have certain desires, and those desires are shaped by advertising, note that you don't naturally desire a phone. The fact that you desire a phone in the first place is a product of social conditioning. That's exactly the type of conditioning that is shaped by this norm of innovation. People desire things that they don't even need. People desire phones with a 4K screen and 64 gigabytes of memory, which reasonably you should never need. We think that it means that not only are people interested in buying things that waste their money and means that companies don't innovate on other things that are better, because we think that symmetrically there is going to be an incentive to do things like research, but the question is whether you direct those research towards improving existing products or whether you direct those research towards building new bullshit that we think that the average person doesn't need. That means that people's lives are far better on our side of the house. But second of all, I think that the pressure is so pervasive to innovate, to buy the new thing, that people are forced to buy conformity to get the new iPhone because your friends have the new iPhone. People substantively don't have the choice about what they buy to the extent that innovation is so pervasive, so normalized, that I think that people are forced to waste a lot of money. But second of all, we explain that people choose different careers to the extent that things are socially valorized or not. And note that they're other than pay differential, people routinely choose a career because it's socially valorized. And so I think that this is actually quite a large impact. I want to just weigh this first of all. I think, first of all, there's very good reason to think that research is going to be symmetric on either side of the house in terms of the quantity of research. This is analyzed to some extent by CO. I think that the further reason, and this directly clashes with O and takes them out of the round, is that the average person doesn't control where money goes for massive finances. We think that this money is disproportionately controlled by things like hedge funds, which are extremely rational agents that have mathematical models, probably aren't that affected by social norms. The stock market requires constant growth, which means that you need to find new products to fund things. So the question is not whether or not things are new. The question is not whether or not you make improvements. The question is whether you make improvements that are just there because they're improvements, or whether you make improvements that need to be justified by the customer on the basis of the actual thing being good. So we think that maintenance on our side of the house ends up looking like improving products in tangible ways that help people. But additionally, I'd like to weigh this just on the depth of potential negative impact. We point out that maintenance is an absolute necessity on either side of the house. Things like banking systems are literally coded in Haskell, which require massive long-term maintenance. Security systems for national systems, for websites that contain deeply private information are also ancient and require a huge amount of maintenance. To the extent that you get worse people in these systems, to the extent that you get bosses who are less likely to allocate budgets to these because these are socially not valorized and the tech CEOs want to put a bunch of money towards random innovation, you are far more likely to get systemic failures that do things like leak personal information and damage bank accounts. And I want to note that this is a prerequisite to innovation, because if you have fucked up fundamental systems, if you can't use access online banking well, or if you have other massive problems with the basics, then you're not able to effectively innovate because you can't run your lab well, or you can't effectively do investment. So the net result is that it is unclear that you're able to access any benefit on their side of the house to the extent that you have lots of problems. Note that cost also compounds. So if you have problems with maintenance and you end up not sufficiently maintaining a system, fixing that system after the fact costs huge amounts of money, massive delays. This is actually what delays a lot of innovation, so probably innovation is relatively efficient on our side of the house. Okay, I want to directly take out closing opposition then. First of all, on their point about how this is symmetric, we think that companies express this in different ways. You can spend resources in different areas. It's unclear why a company has more of an incentive to sell five $20 sweaters versus one $100 sweater. We think that companies can still profit on our side of the house when consumer demands are different. They just profit in ways that are better. But second of all, on their actual extension about relationships, one, it's just not clear that this is even in the round. I don't think anybody's like, wow, I'd like to innovate by getting a new girlfriend. I think that's not at all how the social norm is applied. But second of all, I think that it is unclear that just because a social norm says that innovation is good means that it's not scary. The impacting that you actually hear out of the member of opposition is, look, people are less scared about changes in their life. The norm is not that innovation is not scary. It's unclear why this is a large change. Two, I think that people do empirically make way too many hasty decisions in their life. The divorce rate is massive in the status quo. It's probably fine if people waited longer and didn't innovate so much in their personal life. I think that there's symmetric incentives to find somebody that you love. It's probably better that people do that in a less hasty way. But three, I think people have a range of preferences and they naturally express that. It's unclear why a social narrative is necessary. So it may be true that some people are bored with the suburban life. Those people can opt into jobs where they have to travel a lot. People who don't want to do that don't have to opt in. Uniquely, it's things like consumerist culture, which I think is things that you can't opt out of because it's so heavily normalized and forced on you by things like advertising. Okay, I'll take closing.
There isn't a zero-sum amount of companies and there isn't a zero-sum amount of customers. You can find $5,000 $100 sweaters sweaters on the internet right now, just that most customers have decided that a $20 sweater is cheaper.
Yeah, they haven't decided it. It's they're forced by social norms which valorize certain things because your desires are massively shaped by things around you. And note that the reason why the $100 sweater is better is because it lasts more than 5 times as long. This is quite intuitive. Fast fashion is terrible in a variety of ways. Lastly, I just think that it's not clear that it's not clear that having kids is considered innovative. It's not clear that getting divorced is considered innovative. I think there are other narratives about self-fulfillment, about doing things that you like and finding your true career, a true calling. That means that you have a symmetric incentive to explore other options. Not clear why this is the margin. Lastly, taking out opening opposition. I already explained why I think you're going to symmetrically get investment financially in innovation, and this applies directly to both green technology and medicine. Those types of things probably happen either way. But we think that, in addition, they have this argument about how there's going to be more political advocacy for change. I want to note that, first of all, probably there's competitive international pressures to do things like innovate. So in tech sectors, for example, China and the US both want to get ahead in green technology, and this means that either way you're going to get massive investments. But second of all, on this point about business leaders, I give a POI, and Vidit's response was just to fall back to the policy advocate stuff. I don't think that there's any argument about why business leaders, who I think are hyper-rational, are actually not going to invest well. Lastly, on social movements. Again, not clear that this is in the motion. I think that it is quite clear that when people are advocating for civil rights, they're not calling it innovation. Martin Luther King wasn't like, I have a dream of innovation, right? But second of all, I think that it's not clear that this is a margin for people who are actively suffering to give up their protests. I think that if you're a minority who's being actively discriminated against, regardless of whether or not there's a narrative, you're still going to push actively. And I think that the CO's explanation of how oftentimes maintenance and innovation in social context is shaped by dominant social forces also takes this out. At the end of the debate, you should think this. Maintenance is a critical prerequisite because if your existing systems don't function, your future systems don't function. The only way to have effective maintenance and to effectively allocate resources is when consumers demand what they actually need. So proud to propose.
Thank the previous speaker for that time speech. I now welcome up the opposition to conclude the case of the opposition debate and conclude the debate.
Everyone else was doing thank yous, so I'll be innovative and also do thank yous. Thank you, Reana. It's been absolutely lovely. But I think more broadly, I want to thank Canadian debate writ large. I think it's been one of the most important components of my life. I think it's made some of my strongest friendships. And I think it's been one of the most important things in terms of forming who I am and how I exist in this world. So I hope all of you continue this legacy. I'm old as fuck. I won't be around for very long. So I hope all of you continue to develop and innovate on this circuit for all those reasons. I want to be real. I think most teams in this debate were a little bit of a snoozer. I think we should win exclusively on the basis that we had the most innovative and interesting case. I think that's basically gives you unique mechanisms that are not at all symmetric and actually provide the mechanism by which this narrative exists and actually affects people coexisting with all other narratives that exist in the world. I want to flag at the top of this speech something that I think takes out almost every team in this debate, which is that this narrative does not exist in a vacuum. This narrative exists within the context of all narratives that also pre-exist. So, in the context in which there is a narrative and a structural incentive for companies to make a profit, this narrative is not going to supersede that incentive, and people are going to act in similar ways, and they're likely to weaponize these narratives to enable this. On the stuff about consumerism and activism, presumably, consumers have an incentive to buy stuff now that is cheaper because they have hedonic incentives to get the dopamine rush of buying the cheap sweater that they have the capacity to afford now. So presumably then that context, again, that existing other incentive co-ops and presupposes and dominates over that. In the context of political incentives, note, and I think this is flagged quite well by Anders, things about public policy are not within the scope of this round. No fucking person is ever like, I think racism, should I innovate on racism or should I stick with the status quo and not deal with racism, right? Presumably, people have an incentive to improve their quality of living and to improve the standards that they live under, and they will do whatever mechanism they need to do that again does not clash with this narrative. Narratives coexist and people supersede certain other narratives' incentives when those things are directly in conflict. Oh, what if innovation has maintenance as a prerequisite? You can't innovate unless you maintain the underlying systems. Note, no one's stupid enough to not know this. If they know that maintenance is a prerequisite to innovate, they'll maintain their systems in order to access innovation. No one is going to burn their candle at both ends to the point where they can no longer function. If I know a prerequisite for me programming and developing software is me maintaining my servers at my company, I'm going to maintain my servers and then innovate on the software on the other end. So again, I don't buy that this trade-off that comes out of closing government exists in this debate. I buy that there is a clear margin by which people understand that when they have to innovate and maintain those systems, they're going to do that.
Finally then, on contexts in which innovation is absolutely necessary. I think Reana gives you some very clever framing that comes up exclusively from her speech, which is the world we live in is not static. And in a lot of contexts, in order to maintain the status quo, innovation is a prerequisite for maintenance in those contexts. In the context of climate change, if people want to live in a world in which their children's planet is not flooded, presumably the mechanism and the incentive to innovate in those contexts is going to kick in anyway, irregardless on either side. So I buy from government that they're going to have some solvency for climate change, contrary to what OO says, because people understand that in order to maintain the status quo, we need to build upon what we already have. This is the premise of Paris, which they concede in their speech, which is literally we need to maintain our existing emissions levels to a reasonable amount in order to maintain a standard of living in which everyone's not fucking forced to flee from Bangladesh in order to stay in their homes. That requires some degree of innovation. So again, all of these large-scale impacts in this debate do not kick into power because we do not believe any team has sufficiently proven that this narrative is fundamentally strong enough to overcome and supersede any pre-existing incentives or narratives that are more proximate to people in this round. We think then that we should win on the margin where this round actually has what OO is so coveting, the margin, where it is a thing that in a vacuum, independent of other incentives that affect it, actually affects how people live and how people organize their lives. First thing, narratives affect people, and therefore people are probably the most affected actor in this debate. Systems have inertia. Systems have other incentives, and they have a capacity to act in a way that they're already acting independent of social norms. It is incredibly fucking difficult to move the engine of capitalism in the direction that you want on either side of the house by narrativizing your way into it. It's incredibly difficult to move the engine and the bulldog of human progress and civilization as a consequence of this motion. What you can change is how each individual hears this narrative and organizes their life, and I think that's the most important thing in this round. How does this manifest? How do people interpret this round? I think what people hear when they have to think about maintenance is that they should stick with what their life currently looks like. They should be contented in the status quo, and they should be contented in the things that they live with. World religions have pushed this narrative for a very long time. This is the thing that is deeply entrenched in how people ought organize their life, living relatively ascetic existences without seeking out new innovative pleasure. The problem is that this is fundamentally at odds with two things: human nature and the nature of this world that we live in. On human nature, humans are fundamentally hedonic creatures. We demand more and more and more, and we are not contented existing and sticking to the status quo. We need greater fulfillment from things. We need to have different experiences and exposure, because constant exposure to the same thing leaves us numb. It doesn't give us the same experiential benefits, and it leaves us fundamentally flagrant. This takes out the stuff on love from OG, because OG says you're in a relationship, you want to stick it, you don't want to innovate it too much. Tell me if your partner did the exact same thing, never did anything interesting, never moved from the initial conditions of your relationship. Even if you changed in a person, I think you would be deeply discontented with that person. I think it would be a miserable relationship that left people fundamentally miserable. Sure, opening half.
Yeah, I think waking up, kissing my boyfriend, doing the same job, having a super boring life actually sounds amazing. The problem is that it doesn't meet my basic needs. It's that the narrative you're advocating for tells me that it isn't enough. That's the problem that you're talking about.
I think there is, I think in some senses it isn't enough, right? I think as a relationship, you need to grow and change as people. I think there are going to be conditions that you need to adapt to. And being too pushed on a needle in which you need to maintain a status quo that is an illusion predicated on your false remembrance of a reality that never was means you are constantly chasing a high through rose-colored glasses to maintain what was. People's expectations of the past are artificially inflated. People's perceptions of how things change is predicated on a past and a present that does not exist. And so when people see deviations, they are left with discontentment. We need the capacity to innovate and accommodate changes that occur in our lives. We need the capacity to make sure that we have the capacity to accommodate for the things that make our lives meaningful. The weighing in this debate is incredibly clear. All of the high-minded concepts that everyone tries to push in this debate fall out because they fail to prove exclusivity and why this norm is a tipping point to overpower the other norms that they concede exists. The most important impact in this debate is the capacity to be fulfilled as people, to overcome the limitations of our biology to which we are not comfortable being stagnant in a position without fulfillment. It is the capacity to fulfill our lives and the destiny that we are so inclined to do. Speaker, I think this round is very clear. No teams prove anything but Rita. We win on a very small and innovative margin. For all of those reasons, so proud to oppose.
Thank you for speaking for that final speech. I thank everyone for an incredibly good debate. It's really been